Donald Trump just hung up on the Prime Minister of Canada. It happened mid-sentence during a call that both nations agreed was the final chance to resolve the trade crisis through negotiation. Mark Carney was only 11 minutes into a 45-minute scheduled talk when the line suddenly went silent. He was presenting the third part of a compromise framework his team spent 3 weeks building when the connection was cut. This was not a technical failure, and it was not a dropped connection. The president intentionally terminated the call while the prime minister was speaking, and it never reconnected because it was not meant to. For 6 hours after that phone call ended, Ottawa said absolutely nothing. No official statement, no press conference, and no leaked fury, just total silence from the Canadian government. Washington interpreted that silence as shock evidence that the hang-up had landed exactly as they intended. They thought Carney had been stunned into submission by a raw display of dominance from the diplomatic playbook. Senior White House advisors were telling their colleagues that the silence proved Canada finally understood who held the power. One advisor reportedly claimed, "He got the message. Sometimes you just have to show them who is in charge." But Washington was wrong. That silence was not shock, and it was certainly not submission. That silence was the sound of a government preparing the most devastating retaliatory package in the history of allied democracies. Within 24 hours, Canada announced 5 simultaneous retaliatory measures so precise that trade analysts are struggling to find a comparison. There were immediate tariffs on American exports across 7 sensitive sectors and energy restrictions affecting 12 American states. They even recalled the Canadian ambassador to the United States, the first time that has ever happened in their history. They also suspended defense cooperation frameworks. It included elements of NORAD joint operations, and one move Washington never saw coming, a complete regulatory freeze on American financial institutions. Every single measure was linked in the official statement not to trade policy or even the current tariffs. It was not about economic grievances, but what Ottawa formally described as the unacceptable conduct of the president during diplomatic communications. Warren Buffett said Trump just demonstrated the single most expensive impulse in politics and explained why deals fall apart. More partnerships and alliances are destroyed by 5 seconds of disrespect than by 5 years of serious disagreement. But it is what Carney said in his public response that really tells the story. 9 words, delivered with a coldness that silenced the room and reached every camera on Earth, proving this crisis crossed a line. It is a line that policy concessions simply cannot uncross. Wait until you hear what was actually being discussed, the massive offer Carney was making when that line went dead. Think about what Ottawa was doing during those 6 silent hours while Washington was busy celebrating their power move. You and I are going to look at what this package contains and what Buffett says happens when you confuse contempt for leverage. You will understand why this phone call may be the most expensive 11 minutes in modern diplomatic history. Hit subscribe now, because Carney has made it clear that the response is far from finished. Let me take you through what was actually happening on that call, because the context makes this hang-up more than just rude. It makes it the most self-destructive 11 minutes of this entire international confrontation. This call had been carefully arranged through back-channel negotiations over 2 full weeks. Both governments agreed this would be a direct attempt to find a resolution before the trade war entered its next phase. Economic advisors on both sides warned that the next step would cause permanent structural damage to the relationship. The Canadian side did not come empty-handed. They had prepared extensively for this moment. Carney's trade team, his National Security Council, and his economic advisors spent 3 weeks building a compromise framework. They created a comprehensive package of mutual concessions designed to resolve the immediate tariff dispute. They wanted a new trade architecture with binding rules to prevent future crises from ever escalating to this point again. This was not some minor proposal, it was a serious, detailed, and highly calculated move. It revealed just how carefully Ottawa had studied the American domestic political landscape. The entire deal was actually structured so that Trump could claim a massive victory. The compromise offered a partial rollback of Canadian measures, specifically the energy restrictions. It addressed mineral export limitations and regulatory barriers costing American industries billions of dollars. They wanted a partial rollback of American tariffs and a clear timeline to negotiate the remaining trade disputes. It featured an energy cooperation deal, locking in Canadian exports to the United States at priority rates for 15 years. According to Canadian data, this provision alone would have slashed heating costs by 11% across the Northeast and Midwest. There were agreements for critical minerals that defense contractors wanted, along with a massive joint infrastructure investment framework. It would have poured billions into cross-border projects in swing states critical to the president's re-election campaign. Every detail had a dual purpose: real economic growth paired with a political win the White House could brag about. This was never a hostile deal. It was a diplomatic off-ramp, carefully built by Canada to let the president exit the trade war with dignity. The call started at 2:15 in the afternoon Eastern Time. On the line for Canada were Finance Minister Carney, the Foreign Minister, their top negotiator, and 4 senior advisors. The American side included the President, the Trade Representative, the National Security Advisor, and 2 senior staffers. You and I have accounts from 5 separate sources, and they all agree the tone was difficult from minute 1. Trump skipped the usual diplomatic pleasantries entirely. Instead, he demanded Canada immediately drop all retaliatory trade measures before he would even consider any American concessions. Carney countered that his framework addressed both sides' needs simultaneously, suggesting they hear the full proposal before judging any single part. Trump cut him off. Carney tried to continue. Trump interrupted him again. According to Canadian officials present, Carney kept his cool, walking through the framework with the systematic precision of the central banker he used to be. 11 minutes in, Carney was mid-sentence, explaining the energy cooperation provision, the very provision meant to lower heating costs and secure energy for 15 years. He was detailing the pricing and volume commitments that would have saved American consumers billions. Based on 3 officials who heard the call, Trump interrupted one last time, saying, and I quote, "Mark, this isn't working. You people don't get it. Call me when you are ready to be serious." Then, the line went dead. The Canadian officials sat in stunned silence for several seconds, waiting for the connection to come back. It never did. The President of the United States had hung up. A 45-minute meeting lasted only 11. A 3-week compromise framework was heard for only 7 minutes, and the energy provision that would have saved billions was silenced by a dial tone. For 6 hours and 14 minutes, Ottawa said absolutely nothing publicly. The Canadian government remained completely silent. But what happened during those 6 hours is exactly why this story ends the way it does. Meanwhile, Washington filled that silence with celebration. Within an hour, White House leaks began framing the hang-up as a powerful display of strategic dominance. One senior official bragged to a reporter, "The president won't sit through lectures from a country that should be grateful for the relationship it has." Another called the hang-up a reminder of who exactly sits at the head of the table. Cable news spent the afternoon debating if this was unpresidential or the tough negotiating style voters wanted. By that evening, the White House communications team had locked in their story. The president had signaled that Canada's terms were unacceptable and required a fundamentally different approach. The narrative felt confident, but the narrative was wrong. And by owning it publicly, the White House ensured they would own the coming fallout. There would be no technical excuse or claim that the call just ended. They had claimed this moment. Inside Ottawa, those 6 hours were anything but silent. Carney called an emergency cabinet meeting within 20 minutes of the hang-up. Let's consider that they stayed in that chamber for 4 hours and 40 minutes plotting exactly how to respond. The discussion wasn't about whether they would respond. Officials tell us the choice was settled before Carney even sat down. We're looking at calibration here. They weighed every move against 3 strict rules. Was it proportional? Was it crushing enough to be unmistakable? And could they maintain the moral high ground required to secure international support? Lawyers polished retaliatory orders drafted weeks ago because Carney and his team were prepared. They had spent 2 years watching the patterns of American diplomacy very closely. They had response packages ready for every scenario, especially a provocation like this. Diplomatic teams immediately reached out to allies through secure private lines. Economic experts ran the final numbers for both the Canadian and American markets. The Canadian ambassador was ordered back to Ottawa for urgent, high-level consultations. A first in their 158-year history. It was 8:29 p.m., 6 hours and 14 minutes after the line went dead. The government dropped a massive announcement across every possible media channel at once. It didn't come from Carney. Instead, 3 of the highest ministers stood together. The defense minister joined them to signal this wasn't just a personal feud from an insulted leader. It was a sovereign nation reacting to its head of state being treated with contempt. The staging itself sent a powerful message. You might hang up on one man, but now an entire country is answering. Let's break this down. The retaliatory package had 5 distinct measures, each hitting a different part of the relationship. The first strike was instant. Emergency tariffs hit 7 sectors, including agriculture, manufactured goods, tech, and finance. Construction materials were also caught in the crosshairs. These tariffs targeted the electoral map, not just the economy. They were looking for leverage. They focused on industries in swing states that the president absolutely cannot afford to lose. Total estimated cost for American exporters? $4.7 billion every single year. No threats, no proposals. Effective at midnight. The second move targeted energy. Canada didn't stop the flow, but they choked it. They cut energy exports to 12 states by 18%. It isn't enough to trigger a full energy crisis, but it is certainly enough to spike heating costs. It's enough to dominate the news cycle and show that their biggest weapon is still fully loaded. That 18% cut was a warning. They could have gone to 100. They chose 18. Notice the restraint. Notice what they are choosing not to do, at least not yet. The third measure was diplomatic. The ambassador was recalled. Every meeting, committee, and joint project was suspended indefinitely. All of it stopped. The official statement made one thing clear. This suspension only ends when the White House starts acting like a professional democracy again. That wording was picked with surgical precision. It made returning to normal about behavior, not policy. It wasn't about money, it was about respect. You can't just buy your way back into the room with trade concessions. The only way back is by proving you can treat the person across from you with the respect that sovereign leaders owe one another. The fourth move hit security cooperation. Key parts of defense collaboration were frozen, starting with a full review of all joint military exercises. Intelligence sharing through Five Eyes and NORAD coordination on continental defense were both put on the chopping block. This wasn't designed to actually weaken North American security. Both sides know defense is essential. But this move sends a direct signal to the one group in Washington the White House cannot afford to alienate the Pentagon. The Pentagon has always been Canada's strongest ally in the American government. Disrupting that bond ensures the top brass will push for a resolution. They're applying internal pressure with an urgency that economic pain alone can't create. What do you think happens next? The fifth measure was the one move nobody ever wargamed. A total regulatory freeze hit every American financial institution in Canada, from banks and investment firms to fintech operations with local licenses. This wasn't an expulsion of American firms. It paralyzed the 5 largest American banks, blocking new accounts, products, or transactions, despite their massive footprint in the Canadian market. The freeze caused an instant revenue collapse and a long-term strategic nightmare. If it lasted, market share would bleed out to European and Asian competitors who wouldn't hand it back once the freeze ended. One Wall Street analyst spelled it out in a leaked Monday morning call. This financial freeze will cost the most because lost market share never comes back. It is the ultimate scorched earth policy. It is permanent damage disguised as a temporary fix. Then Carney spoke. No ministers were used. He spoke personally, and his words made it clear that the line between a trade dispute and something much darker had been crossed. You and I are looking at the House of Commons today, packed with every member and ambassadors from 30 countries, all watching this historic domestic address. Carney stood at the podium without any notes. A heavy silence filled the chamber, reflecting the gravity that everyone in the room already understood. He wasn't angry. Anger is easy to dismiss. This was something else entirely. What Carney delivered was colder than rage. It was the voice of a man who had already decided, simply informing the world of his choice and the reason behind it. He addressed the phone call directly, skipping the pleasantries. He told the room he'd called the president for a scheduled 45-minute conversation. It was meant to be the final chance to resolve a crisis that had lasted 2 years. His team had spent 3 weeks preparing a massive, comprehensive compromise for the Americans. It addressed American economic fears while offering their consumers real, tangible savings. We secured their supply chains and designed it so both sides could claim victory. He paused. The call lasted only 11 minutes. The president hung up while Carney was speaking. The last sound he heard from the leader of his closest ally was a dial tone. He let that sink in. A dial tone. Another pause. He noted that a sovereign nation can handle a lot during a tough negotiation. Economic pressure? They absorbed it. Harsh rhetoric? They endured it. Unreasonable demands? They have heard those too. Those are the tools of hard bargaining. Canada has spent 2 years proving it can withstand them all without losing its composure. His voice dropped. But no nation can maintain its self-respect while absorbing one thing: contempt. He stated that the President of the United States did not reject their proposal. He didn't counter it. He didn't engage with it at all. He just hung up. And hanging up is not a negotiating position. It is a statement that your partner does not deserve to be heard. He stared straight into the camera lens. I have a message for the president, he said, and I will keep it as brief as he did. 9 words. You hung up. We showed up. Notice the difference. The room exploded. The ovation lasted for over a minute. Every member and every ambassador rose to their feet. In 10 minutes, the quote was trending in 14 countries. Within an hour, it was the top headline across the English-speaking world. Within 24 hours, notice the difference became the phrase that defined this entire 2-year confrontation. You and I are seeing the gap between impulsive contempt and a calculated response. A leader who can't finish a call versus a nation that refuses to be dismissed. But one specific detail turns this hang-up from a rude gesture into a catastrophe. It makes those 11 minutes more than rude. It makes them the costliest 5 seconds ever. Today, you and I are going to unpack the exact framework Carney was presenting then. It was the strongest offer the United States had seen in a 2-year standoff. Take the energy provision, which was cut short by that dial tone. It would have locked in Canadian gas and electricity exports at special rates for 15 years. American consumers would have saved $47 billion over the life of this agreement. The mineral provisions gave our defense contractors priority access to Canadian nickel. Cobalt and lithium were included materials the Pentagon considers strategic and currently at risk. Trade rules would have reopened Canadian markets to $12 billion in yearly American exports. 3 independent reports published the week after the call calculated the total value of this deal to us. The range was $89 to $114 billion over a decade. Carney told Parliament that this framework has been permanently withdrawn. The offer that stood yesterday is officially off the table. It will not be resubmitted. It will not be renegotiated. A nation does not spend weeks building a compromise for a partner who won't listen for 45 minutes. This isn't just about a phone call, it's about the rules of global diplomacy. You and I need to distinguish between disagreement and contempt because they trigger different responses. Disagreement is actually productive. It means both sides are engaged and value the negotiation enough to fight. You can impose heavy tariffs and still stay at the table. You can make huge demands and still keep the conversation going. You can even walk away and return the next day with a counteroffer. Negotiation thrives on disagreement as long as both parties feel respected and heard. Contempt kills that. Hanging up mid-sentence is not a tactic. It is a loud declaration that the other person is a waste of time. Once you make that declaration, the negotiation is dead. It is not about the issues anymore, but a relationship damaged beyond repair. You cannot offer trade terms to someone after signaling their voice doesn't deserve to be heard. Warren Buffett has watched this dynamic destroy more deals than any market crash. He has seen disrespect ruin partnerships and massive fortunes more than any market crash. This is the incalculable cost of 5 seconds of pure disrespect. Buffett once said he has seen more deals die from disrespect than from disagreement. You and I should be clear on the difference, because people confuse them constantly. Disagreement is when you think the other person's price is too high. Disrespect is when their time isn't worth yours. Disagreement is fixed in the next meeting. Disrespect haunts every interaction for the rest of the relationship. What happened on that call was not a policy dispute. It was a display of contempt, which turns a negotiable situation into a dead end. Buffett speaks with the precision of a man who has lost money to this error. He once lost an acquisition he wanted badly, one of the best Berkshire could have made. The company was a third-generation, family-owned operation. He loved it because their family pride was the company's greatest asset. They were in advanced talks. The price and the structure were already settled. It started with a team member, someone trusted and otherwise brilliant at their job, according to Warren Buffett. During a site visit, this person was dismissive toward the family's oldest daughter. There was no hostility or rudeness that would ever show up in a formal complaint. He just checked his phone while she spoke, interrupted her, and acted like she wasn't a decision maker. Buffett paused the deal. The family simply walked away from the table. They eventually sold the business to a different buyer for even less money. When Buffett called the patriarch to ask why, he heard a sentence he never forgot. I don't do business with people who think my family doesn't deserve their attention. That one mistake cost Berkshire millions. Today, a similar hang-up is costing the United States much more. He explored the psychology with the clarity of a man who has studied human behavior for decades. You and I need to understand what powerful people get wrong about contempt. They mistake it for strength. They think hanging up or keeping someone waiting proves they are the ones in charge. They believe these gestures show absolute control. They are completely wrong. These actions actually reveal they feel threatened. Confident leaders do not just hang up. Confident people listen because listening costs nothing and reveals everything you need to know. The person who ends the call is afraid of what they might hear if they stay. And the person on the other end of that line always understands exactly what is happening. Mark Carney knows that Trump hung up because the proposed compromise was actually very good. It was so good that staying on the call meant having to accept it. Accepting it meant admitting that Canada had built a better deal than the United States. That hang-up was not a show of power, it was an act of flight. This Berkshire parallel now forms a universal principle that has silenced the entire room. After observing hundreds of negotiations, one pattern remains absolute across every single deal. The moment one side shows contempt for the other, the entire negotiation shifts. It stops being about the money. It becomes about dignity, and that price is infinite. It means the disrespected party will accept worse terms and absorb much higher costs. They will endure more pain than any rational logic justifies just to prove they won't be bullied. Stick with me, because Carney's retaliatory package isn't just about a simple trade dispute. It is proportional to the insult, which is devastating because insults have no fixed price. His closing statement landed with the heavy weight of 70 years of accumulated wisdom. The most expensive sound in any business is a dial tone while the other side is talking. And now, the true cost of hanging up that phone has finally arrived. It's not just diplomatic talk, it is damage measured in billions of dollars and thousands of lost jobs. Together, the new tariffs hit first, and they hit very hard. American exporters woke up Monday to new costs that changed their Canadian operations overnight. Farmers in the Midwest dealing in corn, soy, wheat, and dairy were hit hardest. These tariffs made their products uncompetitive against European and South American alternatives almost immediately. Tech companies with operations in Canada faced hardware tariffs that shattered already fragile supply chains. The total first-week impact, as calculated by national associations, jointly exceeded $900 million. And remember, those tariffs had only been in effect for 5 days. This energy reduction created the exact political pressure it was designed to generate. Natural gas prices in 12 states rose between 14 and 22% in 1 week. Heating cost projections for the winter were revised upward across the entire Northeast and Midwest. The governor of Michigan, whose state depends most heavily on Canadian energy, took action. You and I are watching a press conference that captures the pure fury of this moment. My constituents are going to pay more to heat their homes because the President of the United States couldn't stay on a 45-minute call. That is where we are, the governor of Minnesota said. I need someone in Washington to explain why heating bills are rising just because the president hung up on a man offering us cheaper energy. 3 Republican senators from energy-impacted states issued a joint statement, not attacking him directly, but they demanded immediate diplomatic action to resolve the disruption language that everyone in Washington understood as a silent demand for an apology. Unspoken, this financial freeze sparked panic in a sector that assumed it was immune to trade wars. The 5 largest American banks hold over $200 billion in Canadian assets, deposits, and investment portfolios. The freeze did not threaten existing assets, but it strangled the ability to grow, to compete for new business, to launch products, and to defend market share against rivals who were not frozen. Bank stocks dropped between 3 and 6% on the first trading day. One analyst at J.P. Morgan wrote that this financial freeze is a slow-acting poison. Every week it continues. Market share flows to competitors who will not return it. This isn't a reversible tariff, but a structural competitive loss that compounds over time. Recalling the diplomats created consequences that extended far beyond mere symbolism. Without an ambassador, visa processing and cross-border commerce began to degrade and break down immediately. Citizens in both nations found themselves navigating a broken bureaucratic system that had lost its primary facilitator. Business operations relying on diplomatic channels for permits and approvals found those doors closed. The practical cost of severing the human infrastructure of our relationship was vast. It was felt by millions of people who had nothing to do with the call that triggered this crisis. You and I must now consider the international question that every allied leader is asking both privately and publicly. If the president hangs up on Canada, a G7 ally and a Five Eyes member, the nation that shares our longest peaceful border, will he eventually hang up on me? Japan's prime minister raised this concern with the British prime minister, and the conversation leaked within hours. France's foreign minister stated publicly that diplomatic courtesy is not a luxury. It is the infrastructure of international cooperation, and when it is damaged, every relationship built upon it is weakened. One European diplomat, speaking anonymously, was even more blunt about the situation. Every leader with a phone call scheduled is now deciding whether to call or cancel, not because they fear policy, but because they fear the public humiliation. A superpower that its allies fear being humiliated by is a superpower that is losing its allies. You and I see American politics fracturing along a line no strategist ever anticipated. The line between people who were on the call and those who were not. Senior staff on the American side, including the trade representative and security advisor. They were reportedly furious, not at Canada, but at the president himself. One official who was present told colleagues in reported comments that leaked within 48 hours, "We had a deal. We were hearing a deal that gave us everything we had been asking for." And he hung up because he did not want to listen to the details. This isn't tough negotiation. This is pure self-sabotage. The security advisor told the Secretary of Defense that this fallout was the direct result of a choice he witnessed, one he saw in real time and could not stop. Congress is split between those defending the president and those watching the economic damage pile up. Damage that is hitting their home districts by the hour. One Republican senator said privately, "He hung up on cheap energy for my constituents." How can anyone defend that? I certainly can't. No one can. So, let's look at exactly where we stand. The United States president just hung up on Canada's prime minister mid-sentence. Mid-offer, just 11 minutes into a 45-minute call. For 6 hours, Ottawa prepared while Washington celebrated. Then Canada fired back with 5 simultaneous retaliatory measures. Emergency tariffs on 7 sectors, an 18% energy cut to 12 states, and their ambassador was recalled. Key defense cooperation elements were instantly suspended. They froze all regulations on American banks operating in Canadian markets. A framework worth $89 to $114 billion over 10 years, a deal meant for both sides, was permanently withdrawn. Mark Carney stood before the House of Commons and delivered 9 words. "You hung up. We showed up. Notice the difference." Warren Buffett explained that this retaliation was far beyond anything a normal tariff dispute generates. That is because the response was not proportional to trade. It was proportional to the pure contempt. And contempt has no price ceiling. Can this relationship survive when one leader cannot finish a 45-minute call with the other? Can the compromise that died on that call ever be salvaged? Or was the offer withdrawn alongside the respect that made it possible? Can this financial damage and diplomatic rupture be reversed by simple policy concessions? We have to wonder, or does healing a relationship after such contempt require something no trade deal can provide? Now, you and I have to ask the question that should haunt every advisor in that room, every official who watched it happen, every citizen who is now paying the price. What does it cost a nation when its leader mistakes a hang-up for winning? Trump hung up to project dominance. Instead, he showed contempt, and that carries a price dominance can never pay. He ended that call to show he did not need Canada's offer. Instead, he demonstrated he did not respect Canada's leader. And respect, once destroyed, cannot be repurchased with tariff adjustments or late-night phone calls asking to try again. He thought hanging up was a power move. It was the most expensive 11 minutes of his presidency. 11 minutes that killed a deal worth $100 billion. It triggered retaliation that will cost American consumers and businesses for years. It fractured the most stable alliance on the continent and gave Mark Carney the 9 words that define this chapter of history. 9 words every world leader heard, every foreign ministry recorded, and that the White House still hasn't answered. You hung up. We showed up. Notice the difference.